Hi everyone, we're going to be starting our next unit, which is taking populations and then seeing what happens when you place them into a community. So just as a reminder, community is when you assemble all of the populations of organisms that live together in a common area that are close enough for them to have interactions with each other. Some important guiding questions for this chapter. Number one, how do abiotic factors, which are just environmental factors, how do these interactions between populations affect both the composition and distribution of communities? So pretty much, what is affecting the way a community is arranged? Another question, what are the community dynamics and how are they changed by environmental changes? And also, how are endangered species, agriculture, and disease control affected by community dynamics? Those are different applications of studying community ecology. So there's a lot of different kinds of ways that populations can interact with each other. These are called interspecific interactions, which means that there are relationships with individuals of different species in the community. And so they can have different effects. The first one is competition, and this should be the most familiar to you guys. This is just when you have two populations of different species that are competing for the same resources. And this has a negative effect on both species. A common example would be squirrels and black bears, which doesn't sound like they'd be competing with each other, but they both eat like the same kind of food. Another kind of interspecific interaction is mutualism. And mutualism is the opposite of competition, where both populations benefit from this interaction. So an example of this would be flowers and bees, where flowers benefit because bees help them to pollinate and to reproduce and spread, and bees benefit because they get the nectar from the flower. Predation is where one species is negatively affected, where one of the species kind of feeds off of the other one. And this is an example would be crocodiles versus fish, where the crocodiles get a food source. For the fish, this is bad. It limits their population growth. Herbivory is kind of similar, where animals are consuming plants, and so the animals benefit, but the plants do not. And an example of this would be caterpillars and leaves, where caterpillars eat the leaves. And then the last example is parasites. And this is an example where parasites feed off of the host, and so the parasites or the pathogens benefit, but the host obviously is affected by that. An example of that would be ringworms and humans. So the first example is competition. And just before we talk about this, I wanted to define a term called ecological niche. And we've discussed this a little bit in class, but a niche is the sum of an organism's use of the biotic and abiotic resources in its environment. So that's a complicated way of saying that it's just the very specific role in the environment that an organism plays. So, for example, there might be a bird that plays a certain niche where it's the kind of organism that lives in trees and it eats seeds, and so it kind of plays a specific role in the environment as the one that lives in trees and it eats a certain kind of food. And so we have a lot of interspecific competition when two populations overlap in their niches, and so they're both like trying to occupy the same space in the environment. And this lowers the carrying capacity for both of the populations, which is why it's negative for both of them. And here's just a picture of a lion and hyenas. They both tend to compete for the same kinds of prey. Okay, mutualism, where both parties benefit. An example of this would be the reef-building corals and photosynthetic dinoflagellates. And this is a picture of them. It's very pretty. And so what happens is the coral provides the shelter and access to light for the dinoflagellates. And then these little organisms actually produce sugars from photosynthesis, and that can be used by the coral animals that live on the coral to be able to build the coral skeleton using calcium carbonate. So the coral provides shelter, and then the dinoflagellates provide the food, like the sugars that are used by the coral animals to help build its skeleton. And something else is that the dinoflagellates can actually use the coral reef waste products to make its own proteins. And so there's a lot of different ways that they both benefit from each other. Predation. So the benefit's the predator, but it kills the prey. And because of this, there's actually a lot of defenses that prey have evolved to have to help them protect themselves from predators. One of them is imitation. And so this right here is actually a picture of a dronefly. And it looks very similar to a honeybee. And because of that, some predators, natural predators, may not attack the dronefly because it thinks that it can possibly sting when it can't. So imitation is one way that a prey can defend itself by looking like a more poisonous or more like vicious, similar other species. Camouflage, that's just when a prey looks like its environment, so it's difficult for the predator to find it. There's different kinds of mechanical defenses. For example, mechanical just is like the physical defenses it has. There's quills that porcupines have. The clams have very hard shells, so it's hard to open them and eat the insides. There's also chemical defenses. For example, these poison dart frogs are very poisonous, and actually it's kind of like the opposite of camouflage, where a lot of these poisonous animals purposely are very brightly colored to say, like, don't eat me, I'm very poisonous, and so the predators actually try to avoid them. Herbivory is usually not fatal to plants, but it does lead to extra expenditure of energy, and so plants don't want to be eaten. And so there are a couple of defenses. One of them is mechanical, where certain plants grow thorns or spines, so predators can't really land on them. Roses is a great example of this. There's also chemical defenses, where plants become poisonous to certain animals. And sometimes what they'll do is they'll be poisonous, not so poisonous that it'll kill the animal, but slightly irritable for digestion, so that the animals will eat the plant, but then it'll get irritable, and so it will release its feces somewhere else, and it actually helps spread the seeds of the plant. In herbivory, we can also see examples of coevolution. And this is where two species, like the one that eats the plant and the plant itself, kind of co-evolve to both kind of benefit each other, or like they adapt to each other's defenses. And so, for example, this passion flower, passiflora, has developed a lot of poisons, and so only the caterpillar, this specific caterpillar called the heliconus, can really eat it because it's developed special enzymes that can digest this plant's poisons and stuff. And so there's also other examples given in the textbook of ways where things co-evolve, and you could probably think of some yourself. The last form of interspecific interactions are parasites and pathogens. And so parasites live on the host and use it as its food source. Common examples would be flukes, tapeworms, lice, mosquitoes, a lot of the things that we don't want to have on ourselves. But what's interesting is that parasites can affect the environment in many different ways. They can both increase and decrease the diversity. And so an example given is there was this huge chestnut tree population, and there was a pathogen that came in and wiped out almost all those chestnut trees. But the thing is, because the chestnut trees were so tall and they had very large leaves, they kind of blocked out the ability for other trees to grow. So when these chestnut trees died off, they actually allowed a lot of other tree and other plants flourish. So it increased the diversity in that way, but it did obviously negatively impact any species that were dependent on the chestnuts for food source. So, so pathogens, you can kind of think of them almost as like a form of a natural disaster. When forest fires or pathogens spread through an area, they obviously decrease diversity in some ways by killing off the host, but they can actually increase diversity by allowing other species that would have been competing with that species to flourish. All right, thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in class.